We heard cases of children being killed. We heard of the secretive burial of children who died.
Tonight, a First Nation in BC reveals early findings on 4 sites in their territory.
Indigenous veterans in and around Ottawa, we have a bit of an obligation to make sure when our monument was desecrated, we bring it back to the sacred space.
Plus, cleaning up after a hateful action on Parliament Hill.
Overwhelmed, but not in a bad way, in a good way. I'm really excited.
And a teenager becomes the youngest artist to be included in Yukon's permanent art collection. Good evening, Tansei Anine. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. A First Nation in British Columbia has revealed more suspected unmarked graves at 4 sites within their traditional territory. APTN's Tina House was there and has this story, and a warning, this next story contains some very disturbing details.
Here on the grounds of the former St. Mary's Indian Residential School outside of Mission, BC, close to 100 family members, leaders, and supporters gather to hear the results of Phase 1 of the investigation into 3 residential schools and the Kokalitsa Indian Hospital. 158 children are known to have died at the locations, and their graves are marked, but anomalies have also been found on those sites. Dave Sheppy is head of the research team. He says combing through records and recording oral history, they uncovered some very disturbing information.
We heard of the secretive burial of children who died and the forced burial of children by other children. We learned of the secretive burial of babies.
In 1948, a fire destroyed the old school and a new school was built, which still stands today. Sheppy says St. Mary's had a very dark reputation, well known amongst students.
We were told that the St. Mary's old school was characterized as a place of punishment and starvation, and the new school a place of pedophilia.
St. Mary's was opened in 1863 and was closed in 1984. Over 70 First Nations from across BC had children who attended during that time.
We were told of atrocities, including physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual abuse, of capital punishment, of the intentional confinement and exposure of children to diseases as forms of punishment, of forced and exploited child labor to the point of consumption. We were told of malnutrition and starvation, of having to choose between eating green, spoiled bologna or not eating at all.
Mike Kelly is 77 years old now, but when he was 5 years old, he was brought to St. Mary's. He says when he was 10, his close friend Bradley died while at the school, and that he was the last person to see him alive.
They said he was sick, but when I was playing with him the night before, it seemed like there was nothing wrong with him. Yeah. So that's what troubled me was they said he was sick, and I said no, he wasn't, because I was playing with him marbles, eh? And then the night bell rang, so we had to zoom up to bed. The next morning we found out. I didn't find out till later that he was dead, eh?
Kelly says that loss has stayed with him his whole life, and he blamed himself until today, when he was finally able to let his friend go. And for others here listening to the horrors of what happened, heartbreak is evident on everyone's faces as more disturbing details were revealed.
We heard of terrible implications that need further work to further understand. including a story of firemen responding to a fire at the old St. Mary's Girls' Dormitory and finding the remains of fetuses in the walls. And, as is being told in experiences at other institutions, that furnaces were used for cremation purposes.
With 2 to 4% of each location searched by ground-penetrating radar so far, unmarked anomalies were detected, but because it's still early on in the investigation, an exact number was not released as of yet. For years, many stories were told by former students about the horrific abuses that took place here at St. Mary's Indian Residential School. Now that Phase 1 is complete, the research team says they will continue to search for more anomalies. Tina House, APTN National News, Mission.
The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available for survivors and others who might need support. That number is 1-866-925-4419. A cleansing ceremony was held at the National Aboriginal Veterans Monument in Ottawa on Friday morning. This after a flag with a swastika was hung on the monument during a protest march earlier in the week. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
Those for and against LGBTQ2S+ rights in the classroom took to the streets in Ottawa and cities across the country on Wednesday. During it all, someone put a flag with a swastika on the National Aboriginal Veterans Monument a few blocks from Parliament Hill. Tim O'Lone, an Indigenous veteran who organized Friday's cleansing ceremony, says he was disgusted by what he saw on social media.
Indigenous veterans in and around Ottawa, we have a bit of an obligation to make sure when our monument was desecrated, we bring it back to the sacred space.
O'Lone adds such a flag has no place on the monument.
I'll be very clear, the Nazi flag is a symbol of hatred. And when I saw that as an act of desecration. I think even with this past winter's desecration of the National Monument and the desecration when people were dancing on the tomb of the unknown soldier, drinking and urinating on both sites, I think that's just completely inappropriate.
Natasha Dupuis is another Indigenous veteran who attended the ceremony. She agrees the monument must remain pure and free of hate.
Well, this is an Indigenous veteran statue, and it's a sacred space for us to come and gather. And I feel like obviously that is very inappropriate to put these kinds of signs of hate. Yeah, it really disturbed me.
Ottawa police say they have arrested 5 people in relation to Wednesday's protests. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
There's been an upset in the election for Chief and Council of one of the largest First Nations in northern Manitoba. For the first time, the Opaskwayak Cree Nation has chosen a woman to lead them. Maureen Brown won the election with 416 votes from on and off reserve band members. OCN, as it's also called, is about 625 kilometers north of Winnipeg. It has a total combined population of over 6,500. The runner-up was also female and garnered 348 votes. Incumbent Chief Sidney Ballantyne came in at a distant 4th with 297 ballots. Brown is a veteran of 4 terms as a band councillor. She was also with the province of Manitoba's Education Department for 5 years. All right, it's time to step aside for just a moment, but still ahead, the Métis Nation of Alberta has a new leader.
It was a long night, but it was well worth the wait. It was great, fantastic.
Welcome back. Indigenous peoples were rallying on Parliament Hill this week as members of Parliament headed back to work. On Monday, advocates for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across the country were calling on governments to search 2 Winnipeg area landfills. And on Wednesday, chiefs in Ontario and others were calling on the feds to halt a bill recognizing Métis rights. For more on the return of business in the House of Commons, our Truth and Politics panel is here. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist at the Winnipeg Free Press, and Carrie Benjo is the editor-in-chief for Eagle Feather News, and they spoke with Leanne Sanders earlier.
Carrie, on Monday, rallies were held across the country, calling on the federal government and the province of Manitoba to get to work on searching Winnipeg area landfills for the remains of missing loved ones. Family members met with the new Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, and that didn't seem to go too well. What are your thoughts?
I think he's put in a very difficult position. He's new to the job, and this is such a very difficult issue right now for the families. There's so much passion, emotion involved, and I was really struck by what Cambria Harris said. She said the federal government's refusal to commit to funding is a sign that reconciliation is dead, and I think that that statement alone speaks volumes to what Indigenous people are feeling, not just in Manitoba, but across the country.
Niigaan, Minister Anand Desangari was asked about funding the landfill search in the House of Commons the following day, and he had to read a pretty generic response from a piece of paper. Do we read anything into that?
Let's be clear. Carrie's right that there's a certain level of benevolence from the federal minister that brings forth a kind of doubt in reconciliation, or the federal government's commitment to reconciliation. But what the culprit really here is Manitoba Premier Heather Stefanson, who, what is Minister Desangari to do? To pay for the entire 184 plus million? The fact is that the federal government has said under Mark Miller that they were willing to fund part of the search, and Manitoba Premier Heather Stefanson said we won't be paying for any of it. So what's the federal government going to do? Come in on its own and swoop in a province on their jurisdiction and then pay for the entire thing? That's the challenge here, is that the benevolence of the minister comes from the fact that the Manitoba Premier has put the federal government in a very difficult position. They've also put the civic government in Winnipeg in a very difficult position. I was at an event with Mayor Scott Gillingham, Winnipeg Mayor Scott Gillingham, and he asked the same question. He said, we'd be willing to step up and be involved, but the question is we're not paying for it all. That would bankrupt the city. And so because the Manitoba Premier has pushed the federal government and the civic government into these very difficult corners and not willing to pay anything whatsoever, that's what creates that benevolence, or that look as though the federal minister is not invested in the issue. They really don't know what to do. They don't know how to move forward, and perhaps everyone's waiting for the Manitoba election next month.
Okay, switching gears here a little bit. Carrie, First Nations across the country and the Manitoba Métis Federation were calling on the federal government to stop Bill C-53. This is legislation to recognize certain Métis governments. The issue here mainly seems to be stemming from the Métis Nation of Ontario. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they have some very valid concerns, and I think that they're not being listened to. There are issues that this legislation is going to create. There's an issue of land, there's an issue of identity, there's an issue of, just who is actually an Indigenous person. This whole idea of Métis identity, I'm not Métis myself, so I feel less informed to speak on it, but I find that there is so many people that are so quick to claim Métis identity without fully realizing who the Métis are. They are a distinct culture, they're distinct people, they have communities. And I spoke to a Maori person, and he said that anybody can be Maori, and it's a 50%. It's like, you can claim to be Maori, but who claims you? So there's that connection to community, that connection to land that I think that is being overlooked in this argument. And that's what the First Nations chiefs are bringing forth. There is a really larger issue, and their voices are not being heard. And it's scary it's scary for me to see what can happen if this bill is passed, and how it can be manipulated by people falsely claiming Indigenous identity.
Niigaan, is there anything else that you're going to be looking for in the session of Parliament to come?
Well, this is a divide and conquer tactic. You know, you can say what you will about the federal government and their commitment to Indigenous issues, but on this issue, this is really a problem. This is really a problem by not taking a stand on the issue of Métis identity. I mean, the Manitoba Métis Federation is very clear in that the Métis Nation comes from Manitoba, and there are Métis communities outside of Manitoba that were expelled or that left or that departed after the Manitoba Act and SCRIP and went across the prairies and in some parts of Ontario. But if the people, the very birthplace, the individuals that are today talking about Métis sovereignty, Métis identity, are saying that the people in Ontario are not Métis, the federal government, the provincial government, any government should not be stepping in and making agreements with individuals who are saying they're a Métis when the very people who birthed the Métis identity are saying they are not. And so what we're left with is a federal government making paternalistic decisions determining who is and who is not, as Carrie points out, an Indigenous person. And that's just the same old colonial politics of the past. What we need is we need to recognize that this is First Nations land. And so First Nations need to be at the table. And so First Nations should be at least at the very minimum involved in the discussions around this bill. Never mind the fact that it really should be the Métis people, and we should be determining and making a decision on who are making decisions for the Métis. And at the moment, there's a split between the Métis National Council and the Manitoba Métis Federation that has created a lot of problems. And so I don't think anything should be decided till that's sorted out onto itself.
Okay, all good points. Thanks, Nigan. And thanks, Carrie. Thanks for joining us today. We'll have to leave it there, and have a good day.
Miigwech, thanks.
Thank you.
The Métis Nation of Alberta has a new president. On Tuesday, members voted in Andrea Sandmeyer, the first new president of the MNA since 1996. President-elect Sandmeyer is joining us now to talk about the election and where the Métis Nation of Alberta goes from here. President-elect Sandmeyer, thank you so much for taking some time for us, and congratulations. First off, can you tell us your reaction when you found out that you won?
Well, I was elated. I was surrounded by friends and family and supporters, and it was a long night, but it was well worth the wait. It was great, fantastic.
Now, how will your role as the Vice President of Region 2 of the MNA help with this new role as President?
Well, as Vice President in Region 2, I made it my mission to sit down and visit and get to know a lot of our citizens in Region 2 and across the entire Métis Nation of Alberta. And, I learned a lot from them, from the elders, from the citizens, and then as well sitting at the provincial council table, I did learn a lot from President Patra and other people that sat at that table. So I've learned a lot, and I'm ready to go.
And you mentioned President Patra. What have you learned from her that you will take and use in this role?
There's so many things that she taught me, and was a mentor to all of us that sat at the table. Just her grace and her dignity and the way that she interacted with citizens to, colleagues, ministers. It all was a great learning experience.
Now, First Nations in Ontario held a rally on Parliament Hill this week to protest Bill C-53, legislation that recognizes certain Métis governments, and it lays the framework for basically modern-day treaties. First Nations across the country and the Manitoba Métis Federation have all spoken out against this legislation. Where do you sit when it comes to the passing of Bill C-53?
Well, Bill C-53 is our Métis self-government legislation. It is recognition of our Métis government, recognizing our lawmaking powers regarding citizenship, elections, internal operations, and Métis child and family services. It is our legislation, and it only affects our government, our Otipemisiwak Métis government.
All right, well, we'll certainly have to leave it there, President-elect, but thank you so much again for taking on a few minutes of your time for us here today.
Thanks, Daryl.
All right, one final break is upon us. Photo of the day and weather are next. Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. Lindsay Hill shared some of the beauty from the back roads of the Dakota Plains First Nation in the heart of southern Manitoba. Soon those beautiful plains will be covered in snow. Thanks so much for that photo, Lindsay. Be sure to send us your photos to share@aptn.ca for the chance to be our next photo of the day. Right now, let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Beginning on the East Coast, 18 in St. John's and 21 in Charlottetown. 8 degrees in Cartwright and rain and 12 in Kuujjuaq. 22 degrees and clear in Quebec City and 24 and clear in Montreal. 22 degrees in Toronto and 22 as well in North Bay. 22 in a mix of sun and cloud in Wawa and clear in 22 up in Big Trout Lake. Up in Churchill, 21 degrees and clear and 21 as well in God's Lake. 24 degrees in Barons River and 23 in Winnipeg. 20 degrees in Swift Current and 18 in Saskatoon. 20 in Buffalo Narrows and 22 in Stony Rapids. As we continue west, at 23 in Fort Chippewa and 19 in Peace River. Mix of sun and cloud and 23 in Edmonton and 20 in Calgary. 19 and some rain over in Vancouver and 18 degrees in Campbell River. 13 degrees in Smithers and 19 up in Fort Nelson. 10 degrees in Whitehorse and 3 in Beaver Creek. 13 degrees in Fort Simpson and 10 in Norman Wells. 5 degrees in Inuvik and 6 in Colville Lake. 9 degrees in Cambridge Bay and 11 and clear in Chesterfield. 5 degrees in Arctic Bay and 3 degrees in Iqaluit. A First Nations teen from the Yukon is now the youngest person to ever have a piece acquired by the territory's permanent art collection. 14-year-old Cohen Quash is a beater and designer of Tahltan, Tlingit, and Kaska ancestry. The young artist is well known for his signature owl pendants. A galaxy pendant he created for the 2022 Adaka Festival is one of 18 new works added to the Yukon Permanent Art Collection. The 500-plus piece government-owned collection celebrates the very best in Yukon art.
Overwhelmed, but not in a bad way, in a good way. I'm really excited.
Well, that is certainly a wonderful story to end tonight's show with. That is all we have for you this evening on APTN National News. There's plenty more news on our website, aptnnews.ca. For all of us here, thank you so much for joining us. Miigwech, Kinanaskmatin, and have a great evening.